My name is Linda Moore. I'm 69 years old, retired, and living alone in a small lakeside town where the wind knows its way around every corner. I used to work as an ER nurse, the kind who kept a calm face while holding someone's hand through their worst day. These days, my life is keter. I wake up early even though I no longer need to. I like my coffee hot, my radio low, and the sound of birds more than the news. My house is small and tidy, with soft rugs, creaky floorboards, and just enough sunlight to make the mornings feel warm. There's a chipped blue kettle on the stove that whistles like clockwork. I keep a garden out back, though the tomatoes seem to grow only when they feel like it. Most afternoons I walk to the library, not because I need books, but because I like the rhythm of people turning pages. I help out sometimes at the front desk, filing returns, greeting regulars. Nothing official, just enough to stay connected, to feel like I'm still part of something. There's a peace that comes from being useful in small ways, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. I used to think my life would look different at this age. Bigger? Maybe. Louder. Filled with gatherings and people dropping by unannounced. But it's just me now. And that's not always a sad thing. There's something steady about making your own breakfast, watering your own plants, and knowing your next steps won't depend on someone else's plans. Life didn't turn out how I imagined, but I'm still here. And in many ways, I'm more myself now than I've ever been. The invitation arrived in a pale ivory envelope with gold trim along the edge. My name was printed neatly in cursive. No note inside. Just the date, time, and location of the wedding. It was elegant and beautiful. But it didn't feel personal. I read it 3 times, trying to feel something beyond politeness. There was no mention of me. No warmth. No hand-signed message from my son. Just the facts. I kept it on the kitchen counter next to the recipe cards and used it like a reminder to stay hopeful. I ironed the pink dress I had saved for years, the one with soft pleats and sleeves that brushed just below the elbow. I baked a loaf of cinnamon bread, the kind Tyler always asked for in high school when he had a game or a rough week. I even found the cardigan he once said made me look like an old television mom. I held it up to the mirror, unsure if it still fit the way it used to. But I packed it anyway. The venue was a lakeside resort. Big wooden beams and windows tall enough to see forever. I arrived early. Always do. A young woman at the front desk handed me a name tag with a bright smile and no trace of recognition. It just said Linda Moore. No ribbon. No title. No hint I was the mother of the groom. Inside, the room buzzed with laughter and soft music. Servers walked through with tiny dishes that looked more like decorations than food. I scanned the room for someone familiar, but saw only clusters of strangers gathered in comfortable circles. Tyler stood at the front beside his bride, sharp in his navy suit, glowing in the kind of way that makes you forget he ever needed help tying his shoes. He didn't see me walk in. A woman with a clipboard waved me over and guided me to a table in the back. It was tucked behind a sign that read Bride's Extended Family and another that said Groom's Colleagues. My table didn't have a name. Just a plain card with Linda Moore in block letters. I sat next to a woman who raised therapy horses and a man who sold flooring to hospitals. They were kind, curious, and didn't know Tyler. During the toast, someone at another table asked when the groom's mother would speak. There was a ripple of laughter. The bride glanced over and said, "Maybe later." Then she moved on. No one handed me a mic. No one invited me to say anything at all. I folded my hands in my lap and nodded along with the speeches. They were sweet and full of inside jokes I didn't recognize. People clapped. Glasses clinked. And I smiled. Because it's what you do when your heart starts folding in on itself. Spring in this part of the state isn't warm. It's the kind of cold that sits just under your skin. The air felt heavier as the night went on. Not because of the weather, but because I could feel how far I'd been pushed to the side without anyone having to say a word. When the dancing started, I walked outside and stood by the railing overlooking the lake. The water was calm, reflecting tiny lights strung across the balcony. I could hear the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses behind me. No one came looking for me. I stayed there a while. Not crying. Not angry. Just still. I had raised Tyler alone for most of his life. Held his hand through fevers. Sat in bleachers during freezing football games. Stayed up, folding laundry when he forgot his uniform. But in that room, I wasn't anyone. Just another guest in a borrowed seat. Eventually, I returned to my table and waited for the night to end. I left before dessert, wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, and walked to the car with steps that felt older than they had that morning. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence felt more honest than any words spoken that night. The house felt colder when I stepped inside that night. I left my shoes by the door, hung my coat neatly on the hook, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel restful, just empty. David used to greet me when I came home. Even if it was just a nod from the porch or a quick glance over his glasses. He'd been gone for nearly 5 years. But sometimes, like that night, it still felt fresh. His absence had a shape in the house, like a shadow that settled into familiar corners. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and stared out the window. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. I thought about Tyler as a boy. How he used to run down the hallway with socks sliding on the floor, laughing until he fell over himself. That boy was gone. And I wasn't sure when he stopped seeing me. The morning after the wedding, I watered the plants like usual and folded laundry that didn't need folding. I opened the fridge, closed it again, then stood in the hallway, unsure of what I had walked in to do. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt something loosening inside me, like a rope that had quietly slipped from its knot. Days passed, each one slow and gray. I didn't hear from Tyler, and I didn't expect to. I told myself he was busy, adjusting to married life, figuring things out. I told myself what mothers always tell themselves when the silence grows too wide. A week later, the phone rang. His name lit up the screen, and I held it a few seconds longer than I needed to. His voice was cheerful, almost too bright, like someone remembering to sound excited. He asked if I wanted to come by for dinner. Said Claire would be out with her friends, and it could just be the two of us. Like old times. He said. I said yes. Of course I did. After we hung up, I sat with the phone still in my hand. I didn't move for a while. The house was quiet again, but not as cold. A soft hope settled into the room. I told myself maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he had noticed. Maybe this was his way of reaching back. Even just a little. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. Tyler's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. Neat and quiet, with trimmed hedges and matching porch lights. His car was in the driveway, and a warm light glowed from the front window. I stood on the porch for a moment, holding a tin of oatmeal cookies wrapped in foil, hoping this visit might stitch up whatever had come undone between us. He opened the door with a quick smile, offered a brief hug that barely touched my shoulders, and stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled faintly of furniture polish and something like rosemary, but not strong enough to come from real cooking. I didn't see or hear anything coming from the kitchen. We walked into the dining room where a table was set for two, wine already poured into glasses, plates lined up perfectly, no serving dishes, no simmering pot or warm bread in the oven, just a clean table and a stack of papers off to the side, clipped neatly with a pen laid across them, like an afterthought. Tyler gestured to the chair across from his and said it was good to see me. His tone was light, almost rehearsed, like he'd said the words out loud in the mirror. I placed the cookies near the edge of the table and sat down, smoothing the skirt of my dress, trying to ignore the growing tension under my ribs. He picked up his glass and made a small comment about the weather, then asked how the drive was. I answered, but he wasn't really listening. His eyes kept drifting to the papers beside the plates, the ones he hadn't mentioned yet. Finally, he reached for them and handed them to me with a gentle nudge, like it was nothing. Just something to look at, he said, in case anything ever happened to me. For peace of mind, I looked down and saw the heading in bold. Durable power of attorney. He called it a formality, said it would make things easier. No big deal. Just a safeguard. The language in the packet was thick and clinical. Financial control. Real estate access. Immediate effect. No expiration. It didn't say son. It said agent. It didn't mention care. It mentioned authority. He told me there was no rush, that I could take my time. But the pen was already uncapped. It sat there on the table like a quiet suggestion. Like I should have known this moment was coming. I nodded slowly and picked up the papers, turning the first page as my pulse thudded in my ears. My eyes scanned the clauses. But I wasn't reading anymore. I was feeling a slow chill settling over me. The kind that starts in your chest and works its way out through your fingers. This wasn't dinner. It was a transaction. I set the papers down carefully and reached for my glass of wine. Taking a small sip to steady myself, Tyler smiled again. That same practiced smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. He said there was no pressure, but the way he leaned forward, waiting, made it feel like pressure was all there was. I told him I'd take the packet home. Look it over. He nodded. Didn't protest. He didn't need to. The air between us had said enough. I stayed a little longer. Long enough to pretend we'd had a normal visit. We talked about his new job. A book he hadn't finished. Some neighbor who played music too loud on weekends. I asked questions. He gave short answers. And all the while, those papers sat on the corner of the table. Quiet and heavy. Like a third guest, neither of us could ignore. When I left, he walked me to the door, gave another polite hug, and said to let him know if I had any questions. I said I would, but I knew I wouldn't. Driving home, the roads were nearly empty. The sky dark and wide. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I held the packet in the passenger seat like it might say something new if I stared at it long enough. At home, I placed it on the kitchen table and just looked at it. My hands rested in my lap. Still cold from the drive. The house didn't feel like a safe place to return to that night. It felt like a mirror, showing me something I hadn't wanted to see. Something I had spent a long time denying. That love, given fully, doesn't always return in kind. And sometimes, the people you raise will ask for more than you ever thought they would. The night after dinner at Tyler's house, I didn't bother taking off my shoes. I sat down on the edge of the couch with my coat still zipped and the legal papers untouched on the kitchen table. The silence in the room felt unfamiliar. Like even the walls were unsure what to say. The clock in the kitchen ticked once. Then again. Then seemed to stop. I stared at the corner of the rug where the threads curled up just slightly. My hands were still, resting in my lap like they belonged to someone else. After a while, I stood up and walked down to the basement. My knees ached on the wooden steps. But I moved slow and steady. I didn't turn on the full light. Just the small bulb near the back corner, where dust floated in the beam like soft snowfall. Behind the paint cans and a box of holiday lights sat a small gray metal box. David had told me once. in passing, that if anything ever happened, I'd find what I needed in there. I had nodded at the time, never thinking I'd open it. But that night, something shifted. I needed to remember he had existed, that someone had once planned for me with care. I pulled the box out and sat on the concrete floor. The lid creaked as I opened it. Inside, everything was neatly labeled. Folders arranged in order. Statements. Account numbers. Insurance policies. A deed tucked in the back. At the bottom, there was a single envelope with my name on it in David's handwriting. I held it for a moment before opening it. The paper was thick, folded in half, and the ink slightly faded. His words were few, but they steadied me. He wrote that he knew I wouldn't ask for help, even if I needed it, that he trusted my judgment, but he worried the world might not always be kind. He said this wasn't about control. It was about freedom, that he wanted me to be safe, not just from strangers, but from being made small by people too close to see my worth. He asked me not to tell Tyler, not out of anger, but because he believed that money had a way of changing people or showing who they already were. He ended the note by telling me that love should never require permission to protect someone. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside me. Then I opened the folders. There were 2 accounts in my name: investment portfolios, bonds, an annuity, and ownership documents for a small rental property in Arizona I hadn't even known existed. I ran my finger down one of the summary pages and stopped at the total line. Over $6 million. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I closed the folder and opened it again. Not because I didn't believe it, but because it felt like touching something sacred. A truth so big, it didn't know how to fit into a room. But I didn't cry. Not then. What I felt wasn't relief or excitement. It was a deeper kind of stillness. The kind that comes when someone you love sees the storm before you do, and quietly leaves the umbrella open by the door. I sat on that cold floor longer than I needed to. I wasn't thinking about numbers or property or how it would all work. I was thinking about David. About how he had loved in a way that wasn't loud, but strong. About how he had seen the gaps I didn't know were forming and had filled them before they could break open. He hadn't just left me security. Had left me a choice. That night, when I finally stood and closed the box, I didn't feel like someone waiting for help. I felt like someone who had just remembered her own weight. I turned off the light, climbed the stairs, and walked back into the kitchen, where the pen beside Tyler's papers sat waiting. I looked at it once, then set it in a drawer. Gently, like laying something to rest. David's letter stayed in my hand until I went to bed. I kept it on the nightstand, not because I needed to read it again, but because it reminded me what it felt like to be loved without condition. And that was the first night in a long time I slept without flinching at the quiet. The next morning, I pulled out an old birthday card from the back of the kitchen drawer. It had a butterfly on the front and a name scribbled near the corner. Martha Langley. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since her husband passed. But I remembered she had been an estate lawyer before she retired. Someone who always listened more than she spoke. I dialed her number and waited, unsure if it would even still work. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice as steady as I remembered. I told her just the basics. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she paused for a breath, then said I should come by the next day and bring everything. Her house sat at the edge of town, small and filled with books. The kind of home where the air feels warm even in silence. We sat at her kitchen table, the sun slipping through linen curtains, a pot of tea between us. I handed her the envelope from the metal box, every page still in the same careful order David had left them in. She read in silence, glass perched low, the edge of her finger guiding her eyes line by line. When she finished, She looked up and said one thing. "You have more power than you realize." We didn't talk about Tyler. We didn't need to. The trust she helped me build wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. Not from danger in the traditional sense, but from being treated like a puzzle piece someone could move without asking. She asked who I wanted to name as a beneficiary. I told her I didn't know yet. Maybe no one. Maybe someday. She nodded like that. Made perfect sense. We added safeguards. Nothing flashy. Just solid. If I were ever unwell, 2 doctors would need to agree before any changes could happen. She explained each step with clarity. No pressure. No push to hurry. When everything was in place, she slid the final page toward me with a pen. I looked at the signature line and took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Then I signed, not out of anger, not because I wanted revenge. I signed because I was tired of shrinking. I was tired of being grateful just to be included. Tired of being polite at the cost of my own peace. That stroke of the pen didn't change the past, but it marked a boundary. A quiet one. One that said I am not someone you manage. I am someone who decides. Martha placed her hand gently on mine when we were done. Her touch didn't say congratulations. It said, I see you. And for the first time in a long time, I believe someone really did. When I left her house that afternoon, the wind felt sharper than before. Not cruel, just honest. Like the air had shifted to match what I finally allowed myself to feel. I didn't stop for groceries on the way home. I didn't answer my phone when it rang. I just drove with the window cracked and one hand on the wheel, knowing I had done something that mattered. Back in my kitchen, I placed the signed papers in a drawer and closed it gently. The packet from Tyler still sat on the counter where I had left it. I picked it up and placed it in the recycling bin. Then I washed my hands. Not because they were dirty, but because it felt like the right way to end something that had touched too much. Tyler texted me 3 days after I met with Martha. He said he wanted to try dinner again. No pressure this time. Just the 2 of us. Just food. I waited a few hours before answering. Then replied with one word. Sure. I didn't plan to go alone. I called Martha. Told her what was happening. And she offered to meet me a block away. She said she wouldn't come in unless I asked. That was all I needed. I wore a plain sweater and soft shoes. Nothing fancy. Nothing to distract. I brought no dessert. Just my trust documents folded neatly in my bag. Tyler's house looked the same. But something in me didn't. He opened the door with that same half smile and bare feet, like he used to have after soccer practice. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs. There was a loaf of bread resting on a cutting board. And I could see something bubbling on the stove. He gestured toward the dining table. Already set for 2. He poured wine again and asked if I'd read anything good lately. I told him I'd picked up a novel from the library. He nodded but didn't ask which one. We sat. And he ladled soup into our bowls. For a moment, it almost felt like it used to. A flicker of something familiar. But then I saw the papers. Smaller this time. Neatly clipped together and placed on the end of the table. He waited until I had taken a few bites before mentioning them. He said he had talked to a friend who worked in elder law. They'd suggested a simpler version of the paperwork. Nothing binding. Just provisional. Just something to keep things smooth. He smiled. Then slid the papers toward me again. Slow and careful. His voice was soft. Like he didn't want to spook me. But the gesture was the same. A suggestion with weight behind it. I didn't reach for them. Instead, I placed my spoon down, wiped my hands on the napkin, and opened my bag. I pulled out my trust folder and laid it gently on top of his stack. Paper on paper. Not a slam. Just a statement. He looked at it without moving. Then picked it up and started reading. His jaw tightened slightly. Almost invisible, unless you knew him. He turned the pages, scanning the language, stopping at the final signature. My name. Clean and certain. I told him I appreciated his concern. That it was smart to plan ahead. That I had done the same. I told him everything was final. He asked if I had spoken to someone. I said yes. A friend. Someone who understood preparation without pressure. He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on the page. His shoulders stiffened. And then relaxed, like air had gone out of a balloon. He nodded. Once. Then twice. Said he understood. But I could tell it wasn't the answer he had expected. There was a knock at the door. Light. Polite. I didn't need to say anything. He looked at me. I looked back. Then I stood. I walked to the door and opened it. Martha was there in her brown coat, holding a set of keys. She smiled at Tyler, warm but steady, and introduced herself. He looked from her to me, then back again. I said we'd be leaving. Thanked him for the meal. Told him he didn't need to follow up. He didn't argue. Just nodded and stepped aside. I walked down the front steps with Martha beside me. The air outside was crisp. The sky pale, with the kind of light that comes before a cold evening. We didn't speak on the way back to our cars. We didn't need to. My steps felt firm. Planted. Like I had grown back into my own skin. That night, I didn't think about the soup or the wine. I thought about how quiet power can be. Not about forcing someone to listen, but choosing when to stop explaining. And how. Sometimes, the most important lines we draw are the ones we never raise our voices to defend. The next morning, the cold came early. It crept into the corners of the house before the sun had a chance to push it out. I made toast, poured a glass of orange juice, and sat at the table, but didn't touch either. At exactly 10, my phone buzzed once. I turned it over and read the message from Tyler. Just one line. You made this harder than it had to be. No greeting. No explanation. No thank you for coming. I stared at the screen, then placed the phone face down beside the untouched plate. The toast had gone cold. The juice no longer looked refreshing. There was no follow-up. No apology. But I knew what he meant. He hadn't expected to lose control. He had counted on the version of me who nodded along, who said yes before he ever had to ask. What hurt wasn't the words. It was what they confirmed. That all the years I had spent loving him, supporting him, being the one who stayed had become a kind of currency. And when I didn't spend it the way he wanted, the silence turned sharp. I sat there for a long time. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Just clear. Love, when twisted into leverage, stops being love. It becomes something colder. Something that wants permission to take more. And I was done giving it. I moved at the end of February, just before the last of the snow melted. The new house was smaller, older, tucked at the edge of a quiet street not far from the lake. The shutters rattled in the wind, and the mailbox leaned slightly. But something about it felt right. It wasn't the kind of place you pick to impress anyone. It was the kind you choose when you're no longer trying to prove anything. When I stepped inside, the wood floors creaked and the walls smelled faintly of cedar. Like the house had been waiting patiently for someone who didn't need much. Packing didn't take long. I didn't bring the big furniture or the dishes I only used for company. I brought my chipped blue kettle, the recipe cards with smeared ink, and David's photo in its plain wooden frame. There was one box of books, the ones with notes scribbled in the margins. I packed a soft blanket from the old living room and the ceramic owl that had never scared a single bird. I left behind the things that had started to feel like obligations. The guest towels, the fancy glassware, the dining table that had grown too quiet. Each item I chose came with a feeling. Not nostalgia exactly. More like recognition. These were the things that had stayed with me. Even when people hadn't. The movers were quick. And by late afternoon, the last box was stacked in the hallway. I made tea and sat on the floor. Watching the steam rise in the soft light coming through the kitchen window, I didn't feel rushed to unpack. The stillness was different here. Not empty. Just mine. That night, I slept with the window cracked. The wind brushed against the house like a familiar voice. I felt no need to explain where I had gone, or why. I had reclaimed the space around me. But more than that, I had reclaimed the quiet. And it no longer felt lonely. It felt like a beginning. Most mornings, I walked to the library on Main Street. It wasn't about the books. Not really. It was about the quiet hum of turning pages. The comfort of routine. The way people moved around each other without needing to say much. I started helping at the front desk. Nothing official. Just small things. Returning books to shelves. Tidying the magazine racks. Offering directions to the nearest restroom. It gave me something steady to lean into. That's where I met them. Women like me. Not arriving in groups or seeking attention. Just showing up with something unspoken behind their eyes. There was June, who always brought her own peppermint tea in a thermos with her sister's initials. Margot, who walked with a cane but never used it indoors. And Helen, who made quilts out of her late husband's shirts. Each square a piece of memory. We didn't talk much at first. Just exchanged small nods. A smile. Maybe a shared glance when someone laughed too loud in the back corner. Then, one afternoon, Margot asked if I wanted to help with the raised garden bed behind the building. The soil was stubborn, packed tight from winter. We dug anyway. Knees in the dirt. Fingers red. Shirts rolled at the sleeves. We planted basil, tomatoes, and a few sunflowers that didn't care if they made sense there. We didn't make small talk. We didn't need to. We started calling it the quiet corner. It became a habit. We would show up, pull weeds, water, sometimes just sit on the nearby bench and listen to the leaves move. We didn't trade stories. We shared space. Every now and then, someone would mention a grown child or a birthday missed days, but never with bitterness. Just soft facts. Like weather. What we built wasn't a friendship in the way people often describe it. It was a kind of recognition. Healing happened there. Not because we talked about the past, but because we stopped needing it to explain who we were becoming. It was a Saturday morning when I saw him again. I had just finished sweeping the front porch. The sun pushing through after a string of gray days. A car I recognized pulled up at the curb and sat still for a while before the door opened. Tuiler stepped out. No folder this time. Nolla galtone. He looked older somehow. Not by age, but by weight. In his hands was a plain white envelope. Bent slightly at one corner. He didn't walk all the way to the door. Just sat on the bottom step like he used to when he was a boy waiting for dinner. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then stepped down slowly. I didn't sit beside him. But I sat close enough for the porch wood to creak beneath us both. He looked up. Eyes a little tired. And said he was sorry. Said he saw now what he had done. What it had cost. His voice didn't beg. It just landed softly between us, like something that had waited too long to be said. I listened. Then I told him I forgave him. But forgiveness doesn't come with a key. Some doors, once shut, stay shut. Or take time. Or never open again. He nodded. Placed the envelope beside me. And stood. He didn't reach for a hug. He didn't ask for anything more. He just walked back to his car and drove away. I stayed there for a long while. Not waiting. Not grieving. Just breathing. Because sometimes closure doesn't mean returning. It means knowing you're finally safe in the life you chose for yourself. And choosing to stay in it? I used to think healing meant going back. Fixing what was broken. Rebuilding the same bridge over and over just to prove I hadn't walked away too soon. But I've learned that healing often looks like staying still. Choosing not to chase what once made you small. Letting go of the hope that someone else will finally see you the way you deserve to be seen all along. I didn't find peace through confrontation. I found it through clarity. Through setting a boundary that didn't need shouting. Just a quiet line drawn in self-respect. If you've ever felt invisible, or used, or slowly erased by people you love, I want you to know something. You are not selfish for stepping back. You are not cruel for protecting what's left of you. You don't need permission to reclaim your story. You don't owe anyone the softer version of yourself just to keep their comfort intact. Your strength does not have to be loud to be real. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining. Sometimes the most loving act is to choose peace for yourself instead of approval from someone else. So if you're sitting with the ache of distance, if you're wondering whether it's okay to say no, even when love is involved, let this be your reminder. You are allowed to close the door. You are allowed to start over. And most of all, you are allowed to stay. Not because they asked you to, but because you chose you. And that's enough? If this story touched something in you, you're not alone. I hope you'll share your thoughts, your strength, or even just your breath with someone who needs it too. Because you're still here. And that matters more than you think.